Hello, everybody, and welcome back to High School Not So Much a Musical. Today, we are joined with Jared Arcari, who is an expert in the private investment funds market at Paul Hastings. Paul Hastings is the premier international law firm that provides innovative legal solutions to many of the world's top financial institutions and Fortune 500 companies. Throughout this episode, we speak with Mr. Arcari about the importance of financial literacy in high school, what exactly private investment is, the convergence of finance and law, as well as how entrepreneurs can secure strong seed funding for their ideas. To hear more about that and the basics of the stock market, stay tuned. We hope you enjoy. We'll get to that right after this.
This is High School Not So Much a Musical, a podcast that takes you on a ride through the peaks and valleys of a high school journey. Here are your presenters, Nitin Jaladanki and Ayush Agarwal.
Okay, so Mr. Arcari, could you please talk about your experiences over the years working with entrepreneurs and investors to connect the two, such as your work at the Paul Hastings law firm?
Sure, absolutely. So before I came to Paul Hastings, I was at a firm called Goodwin Procter, which actually specializes in the tech and life sciences area. And so during my time at Goodwin, I actually worked directly with entrepreneurs, including, the CEOs, CFOs, and chief legal officers of tech startups. And we'd help them through, their everyday problems, anything from employment issues to their current fundraising. And what I actually did most during that stint in my career for about 2 years was financing, where we would basically help these startups collect money from the private equity industry, and we'd help them form the fundraising round and find investors, and then bring those investors in as investors to their companies. I had a pretty wide range of clients back then as well. I had everything from a clothing brand to some pretty exciting health startups. And what actually became interesting during the pandemic was that one of our health startups that I worked with ended up doing really, really well because they basically aggregate data across hospital systems and help hospitals spot trends. And of course, during the pandemic, that's what every health professional is looking for. And so they did very well. We helped them raise a couple rounds of financing, one after another. And it was very interesting to see, the application of what I do from a legal basis, applying in a real world situation where this company was growing very, very fast because of the current pandemic. And all of a sudden they needed money to grow. And so that's where we actually were, I felt useful for once as lawyers. And then before that, I was also part of the Fordham University School of Law. I was part of their entrepreneur law clinic. And during the clinic, we helped smaller entrepreneurs, I'd say much smaller than the clients I had at Goodwin, but we would help clients that were either lower socioeconomic status or were founded by minorities. And we would help them with mostly their formation and their employment needs. And so I've had a pretty broad range of experiences, I'd say, over the past about 4 years.
I think those experiences are super interesting. And I think this is kind of like a unique role because we've spoken to entrepreneurs, robotics engineers, et cetera, on the podcast. But I think like the work you do specifically at like Paul Hastings is pretty unique. It's also in a more of a niche industry, right? The private equity industry. It's something that people don't have as much knowledge of. So if you could talk a little bit about what the private equity industry is, how it functions, how it gets like entrepreneurs and investors and connects the two. If you could talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. So when people think of private equity, I feel like, you hear things in the headlines, right? But no one ever really knows what it is or what it means or why we have it. Private equity is just another fancy way of saying funding, right? So like a company wants to go do something and they need money to do that naturally, right? There's very few businesses. I guess that's not as true anymore. I guess you can start an internet business or a podcast or an Etsy shop. I guess you can start those pretty easily. But for most big businesses that have a product or want to develop a product that's expensive, let's say a car or a healthcare application or an invention or something like that, they need a lot of money to do that. You need to hire people, you need space, you need to hire IP attorneys to protect what you design, right? You need to pay the factory for what, that is building what you've designed. And so all those costs, right, are either, typically funded through a loan from a bank, right? Or you can go into the private equity area where you can get money from private investors. What private equity does is it basically aggregates money from investors, and that investor can be anyone from, a high net worth individual, so a rich person, for lack of a better term, and go all the way up to, state governments. A lot of pension plans, a lot of teachers' pension plans invest in private equity funds. And so it runs the whole gamut of, people, places, and entities, let's say. And so, they all get together, and a fund manager, a sponsor, we call them, will basically go out into the market and say, hey, I have this really good idea. I want to go and fund electric vehicles. I know a lot about electric vehicles. I know a couple companies that are going to build electric vehicles. I know who to invest in. I know who's going to be the next Tesla. I know it. And so they'll go and they'll basically tell that spiel to a lot of different people, or to pension plans, or to the states, or to cities even. And people will say, yeah, I like this guy. I believe in his vision. He knows what he's doing. I'm going to give him $1 million. And if 100 people do that, right, or 100 entities do that, then what? He has $100 million in the bank that he can then go and spend on, Tesla's competitor, or a battery manufacturer in Oklahoma, or a silicone distributor in California. There's just so many things that go into electric vehicles, right, that this guy knows about. But the average investor or the pension planner or whatnot wouldn't know about that. And so they basically take their money, pool it, give it to somebody who knows what to do with their money. And then that person earns, a certain commission, a little bit of money here and there. But it's really for the benefit of the investors underneath who, have the money but don't really know what to do with it.
So I want to touch on one thing specifically that you talked about, and it was about how people open Etsy shops, they still go out, the classic example of the lemonade stand, and that's a business. But more of a personal advice for myself, and I just wanted to ask you a question. So a little bit I want to tell you a little bit more about myself and the experience that I've had with entrepreneurship. So in the summer of 2020, I attended this incubator in which I started my own business idea. And just to give you a very quick rundown of it, it's basically a drone education startup. And we see everywhere that people are flying drones, people are using them for making YouTube videos or just recreationally. But there's very few amount of people who actually know how to build a drone, how to code a drone, and how the drone works, how it gets lift, how it moves, etc. So based off of that, I identified this niche market of high schoolers who are very interested in STEM, who have a passion for building drones and such like that. And with the team that I was placed with, we started something called Comet Drones, which essentially sells an entry-level drone kit, which means that it's completely plug and play. No soldering, nothing. It will just be plug and play, almost like Lego pieces, but you're given a dismantled drone. And along with that, you're given a online course that we develop on our own, which walks you through how a drone works, how to program it, how it's wired, and everything like that. So for a high schooler like me, if I wanted to come to you asking for money, suppose that I want to hook myself up with a supplier to start building these drone kits, how exactly would somebody approach you in the private equity industry asking for money? And could you kind of give us an example, maybe meeting with somebody if somebody's coming and asking for money?
Yeah, absolutely. So, what typically happens in, a business, right, is you have an idea, like this drone business, right? And there's multiple levels of funding that you can go through. And so most people start with their own money, right? And they'll say, I'm going to, build my website. I'm going to design a prototype, and that's going to cost $2,000, right? So a lot of people will save up $2,000 and then do that. And the next step might be advertising, right? So you have your prototype, You want to get some, foot traffic in the door. So you say, I need $20,000 to do that, right? And so that's usually at the friends and family fundraising level that we call it, where you basically go to your parents, your friends, your colleagues, acquaintances, and say, hey, this is my idea. Here's a pitch deck. Here's all the things I've been thinking about. I need $20,000 to bring it to the next level, and I can give you 15% of the company, right? And so that's like a pretty low level. Where you start breaking into the private equity and the venture capital world, really is what we're talking about now, is more venture capital, especially for startups. But in the venture capital world, right, is where you're starting to say, okay, I need $1 million. I need $2 million because I need to buy, 1,000, I need to build 1,000 units, and it's going to cost me $600,000 to build those units, plus $100,000 to ship it, plus, $50,000 to hire somebody in marketing who can then market these materials to potential buyers. And so that's really where you start getting into the private equity, venture capital world of, identifying certain venture capital firms that might invest solely in drone products, or you said you had an educational piece, right? So then you might also target venture capital firms that focus on education, right, or digital education. And so you basically look at your product and you say, how do I break my product down? It's a drone, it's an electric vehicle, it has an education aspect to it. Is it targeted to certain types of people, right? And then you take all those aspects and then you go out and you do your research on which venture capital firms or private equity firms are investing in those types of areas. Like I said, in your example, though, it would most likely be like the venture capital side of things, which is much more, it's still part of the private equity world, but it's much smaller, it's more niche, right? So there are probably like 4 or 5 venture capital firms. I don't know their names, and I don't know if they actually exist, but there's probably like 4 or 5 of them out there that probably invest a bulk of their money in drones, drone racing leagues, stuff like that. That's their entire investment thesis, is that they know drones, they know how to deploy capital to drones. And, say if I wanted to invest in one of those venture capital firms, I might say, hey, I have $50,000 that I'm not using right now. I think drones are going to be really big in the next 5 years. And so I find venture capital firm A that, spends 80% of its capital on drones. And I might say, hey, here's $50,000. I want you to, invest it in your fund, and I want to see what you can make out of it. And so that would be like the step that you'd probably be taking towards the venture capital side of things.
So I completely agree with you, and this brings me back to the point that when I went to pitch in the later part of the incubator, I went on to pitch this idea to a group of investors, and they were from the 15-17 fund, and it was basically a competition among 6 other teams who also had business ideas. But I think that the reason that we won was because we had a way more developed idea, and we got validation from drone experts who are also in the industry, and that allowed us to get $1,000 in seed funding from the venture capital firm, the 15-17 fund. So I think that this makes more sense in terms of high schoolers and how they should approach starting a real business. So just for everybody listening, you should look into venture capital rather than private equity, because starting off as a high schooler, you don't want to be looking at too much money, rather than you just want to focus on building up your business and your idea. And I think that Ayush is going to ask us the next question now.
And right before Ayusha, starts, do you remember any of the questions that they were asking you? Because venture capital firms, when you pitch them, they ask you very pointed questions about your business model and your idea and your invention. So do you remember, for your audience's benefit, do you remember any of the questions they were asking you, or any particular tough ones maybe?
Yeah, I remember a really tough one, and they straight up just point blank asked, why are people going to buy this? Why should we give you money for something that you're just a small group of kids who don't know what they're doing, and this is just an incubator that you've joined? So they straight up asked us, what will you do with the $1,000, and what are you giving us? What trust should we have in you so that we're able to give you this $1,000? And they wanted clear-cut answers. They didn't want like long drawn general statements that were like, oh, we're going to invest in marketing, we're going to do that, we're going to do this. We were prepared, and we asked, and we told them directly, These are the suppliers. We've reached out to them. These are the people who have validated our idea, and we've told them that I can give you one of the quotes from the slide. And just to give you a little bit of background, there is a person who worked for the Department of Defense, and his name is Patrick Egan. And exactly what he said was, drones are super difficult for teens to understand, which acts as a barrier to get into the growing drone industry. Comet, which was the name of our company, Comet's affordable price point, creation of a course, and unique approach to making drone creation fun and safe sets them up for success. So this was one of the cool questions that they asked us, and we actually prepared for this ahead of time. One of the people just asked us, what are you going to do with the money, and how can I put my trust in you?
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's usually the question that stumps most people, right? Is they come and they say, oh, I have the next best idea. It's going to be worth $1 billion. And I think you should give me $1 billion. And then people say, why? And they go, oh, well, I don't know. Right. And like, it's good when you come prepared for the very most basic questions sometimes are usually the ones that trip people up the most. And so I'm glad that you were able to handle that. It sounds like fairly well.
Yeah, it was a really interesting experience because as high schoolers, we don't really get the opportunity to work like with a curriculum where we're always being challenged to answer questions that we don't typically get asked. So I think that Ayush is going to talk more on that.
Yeah, so switching gears a bit, specifically talking about the high school curriculum, if you look at it, it is very, very career focused. How to make the most money possible when you move into the workforce, so that way you can, raise a family, afford a house, afford basic necessities, etc. However, they don't teach you half of the equation. One half of the equation is making money, which is what school supposedly prepares you for. But the other half is saving money and utilizing the money that you have in a way that allows you to save most of it or invest most of it and make the most out of the money that you already have. So where to spend your money, essentially. It's pretty obvious that the high school curriculum neglects financial literacy. So how are you able to overcome that lack of knowledge coming out of high school and make financially smart decisions after you started making money?
I think there's a difference between the term financial literacy and financial proficiency. Financial literacy is like, do you know how to add and subtract? And do you understand, what a loan is? And do you understand, interest, right? I think those are very, very basic ideas that, I guess some schools may not even reach that level, but I feel like a lot of schools now are starting to reach the literacy level. The problem is that what you pointed out are proficiency standards where, do you understand the difference between, a long-term rate and a short-term rate? Do you understand the difference between compounding interest and simple interest? And do you actually understand, how big of a difference there is between compounding and simple interest there is? Do you understand not just how to balance a checkbook, right, but also how to plan into the future? Do you understand how to, trade stocks? Do you understand how to trade options? Do you even understand options, right? And that's where I think, the school system is lacking severely. Just like trading, I remember when I was in college, towards the end, I think, junior or senior year, I finally just decided that I wanted to invest and I wanted to learn how to invest. And so I opened a Merrill Edge account through Bank of America because that was the bank I had. And I just put $250 into it. And I started playing around and I bought a couple stocks, then I sold them at a loss. Then I bought one stock and I sold it at a gain. And I was like, okay, this is how that works. And then I started doing more research and I started learning that, you don't just pick stocks because they sound cool. You pick stocks because they have a good long-term vision, or that something in the short term is going to happen that might, increase the stock's price. Right. And so you start learning how to research a little bit better as you learn how to trade. And so I think, for the average high schooler, become a little bit more proficient in their finances, I think you should, learn how to trade at the very least. And there's a lot of programs out there too that, basically let you operate a fake account, right? So they'll give you an account with $10,000 of, fake money basically. And you can go out and you can basically trade on the real market with this fake money in a simulated area, of course, not on the real market. But I think that's a great idea for any student that's just interested in learning learning how the financial system works, right? And how, certain things might affect a stock one day, but not another day. And, you start, it's really the research that teaches you a lot more than I could tell you, oh, you should study this topic and that topic, and, you should understand this term and that term. The more you research, the more you learn that you don't know, and the more that you eventually learn, right? So like you might invest in a bank, right? Like you might invest in Bank of America. Bank of America stocks ticker is BAC, right? You might invest in that, and you might, read a research report that talks about LIBOR rates. You might say, okay, well, what's a LIBOR rate? You Google it, you learn that, it's a interest rate set by the London Stock Exchange or London banking system. And so, there's one piece of knowledge that now that you didn't know, 5 minutes ago. And then, maybe you go invest in Tesla, right? And you'll learn very quickly that there's a lot of research materials on Tesla. And so if you click on, the first link of research under Tesla stock, it might say something, like lithium shortage causes, these 3 other stocks to, skyrocket. And you might think to yourself, well, why would a shortage in lithium cause those 3 stock prices to go up and not down, right? Like, wouldn't that hurt the company? And then you click on that link and you learn that, you learn the concepts of supply and demand through an offhanded approach. And so I think those are like the ways that, it's just organic learning, right? Like I learned through trial and error, mostly error, and a lot of trial. And I think anyone can learn that way. And I mean, there's definitely, there's courses on Coursera or other free resources, and I'm sure your school has access to some too, that, can teach you about the stock market in a very, metered way, or they can teach you about, loans and stuff. But I think the best way is just like, to go down the rabbit hole of like Googling stuff. It's kind of like a Reddit hole, right? Like you start on one page on Reddit and you end like 50 pages later. Do the same thing with your stock research, and you'll learn like 50 things along the way. And the last thing I'll say is I think, understanding loans is super important for students to comprehend in high school, because, regardless of socioeconomic status, most students do end up with student loans. I had student loans, even though I came from a fairly, comfortable background. And I didn't have any idea what I was getting myself into. And I literally just like, I'd say 2 years ago, finally understood, like I finally, spread everything out on my desk. And I said, this is what I owe. This is the rate I owe it at. This is how long it's going to take. Right. But like, I should have done all of that beforehand. And it wouldn't have changed any of my decisions, right, to go to NYU or to go to Fordham Law after that. But it would have been better to know beforehand than it would be to figure it out afterhand, where, all of a sudden you look at your bills and you go, holy crap, like that's a lot of money that I owe. There's a lot of things that you guys need to be aware of that they just don't teach you, right? Like, I'll tell you the biggest one, right? So like when you take out a loan, there's something sometimes called an origination fee. An origination fee is basically if the bank gives you a $100,000 loan, they might ask for a 2% origination fee, which is basically a fee to give you that $100,000 to originate it. And so what that'll do is if it's a 2% origination fee, they'll take $2,000 right out of your $100,000 check. And so instead of getting a $100,000 check, you get a $98,000 check, but you still owe them for the full $100,000. So right off the bat, you've lost $2,000. You owe $100,000 still, and you only got $98,000 in. This happens with student loans. All student loans, I think except for like Stafford, there's like some subsidized loan that doesn't have an origination fee, but all of them have origination fees that range from like 1% to 4%. And if you think about it, like even the 1% on, $250,000 for undergraduate loans is a lot of money. And if you look at the 4% range, it's a ton of money. And so just understanding those like very basic concepts, I think, it was super important for you guys just to like, I know it's not like the most exciting information, but it matters. And you'll kick yourself later if you didn't spend 10 minutes researching what an origination fee is, or researching what the interest rate was, this year versus next year, or whether, your loan is going to be a floating rate versus a fixed rate, right? Like floating rates adjust with inflation, so they can get very, very expensive. Whereas a fixed rate, right now is great because, interest is low, but like 10 years ago when interest was like 8%, it wasn't good. And so I would just say, like take some time and figure that stuff out, or, ask your guidance counselors or other college advisors. They know all this information. They're just not used to students asking them about it, right? And if you take the 5 minutes to ask them about it, they might actually educate you on it.
To hear more about Arcari's thoughts on personal finance and private equity, make sure to watch next week's episode, which is part 2 of our conversation, where we continue to talk about these topics more in depth, and also how to get investors for your own startup.
Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of High School Not So Much Musical. And a big thank you to Mr. Arcari once again. That's our show for today. Now roll the credits. High School Not So Much a Musical is hosted by Ayush Agarwal and Nitin Jaladanki. Narration by Samhit Padala. Music from Louis Luang Relaxation Cafe, Tune Pocket, and Infraction. If you like this show, please recommend it to your friends and family. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.